The last stop under a burning sky. The stagecoach door swung open and Eleanor Hayes stepped into hell. The August sun hammered down on Red Hollow like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the air into something you could choke on. 3 children tumbled out behind her, faces blistered, lips cracked white, eyes glazed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from running too long with nowhere left to run. The driver didn't wait. Didn't ask if she had money, family, or a plan. He just cracked the whip and rolled on, leaving 4 bodies swaying in the dust like mirages about to disappear. Eleanor had one name in her pocket and one chance left. Caleb Granger, the rancher who turned every desperate woman away. She was about to become the exception, or die trying. If you want to see how a mother's desperation collides with a man's grief under the unforgiving Wyoming sun, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's story can travel. The heat wasn't just weather. It was punishment. Eleanor Hayes felt it press against her skin like hot iron, felt it suck the moisture from her mouth until her tongue stuck to the roof. She swayed on her feet, one hand gripping the shoulder of her eldest daughter, Lily, who was 12 and trying hard not to cry. Behind them, 9-year-old Thomas leaned against a hitching post, his breathing shallow and fast. And little Samuel, barely 6, sat in the dirt, knees drawn up, staring at nothing. They'd been traveling for 3 weeks, St. Louis to Cheyenne, Cheyenne to nowhere. Every town the same, closed doors, tight mouths, eyes that slid away when they saw a woman alone with children and no husband's name to give them weight. Eleanor had sold everything she owned to get this far. The wedding ring first, then her mother's cameo, then the good shoes, the winter coats, the small painting of the sea her father had left her. By the time they reached Red Hollow, all she had left was a cotton dress stained yellow with dust, a canteen with 2 swallows of water, and the kind of desperation that made a person willing to beg. She wouldn't beg, but she would ask. The general store sat at the end of the main road, its porch sagging under the weight of years and heat. Eleanor pushed the door open and the smell hit her first. Tobacco, leather, sweat, flour. The air inside was thick, trapped, baked. A man behind the counter looked up, his face lined and weathered, his eyes sharp. "Help you?" Eleanor's voice came out hoarse. "I'm looking for work." The man's gaze flicked to the children standing behind her in the doorway, then back to her face. "Ain't much work for a woman with 3 mouths to feed." "Any work," Eleanor said. Her throat burned. "Cleaning, cooking, mending, anything." The man set down the ledger he'd been writing in. "You got family here?" "No." "Husband?" "Dead." He nodded slowly without sympathy. Facts were facts. "You try the boarding house?" "Full." "The church?" "Sent me here." The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Lady, I don't know what to tell you. Red Hollow's a hard place even for folks with roots. For someone passing through—" "I'm not passing through," Eleanor interrupted. "I'm staying." There was a long silence. Somewhere in the back of the store, a fly buzzed against a window. "There's one man," the storekeeper said finally. "Caleb Granger. Runs a cattle ranch about 8 miles north. Big spread. He's been alone since his wife died, maybe 4 years back. Keeps to himself." Eleanor felt hope flicker, small and fragile. "You need help?" "Maybe. Hard to say. He don't come to town much, and when he does, he don't talk." The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He's turned away every woman who's come looking for work, charity, or marriage. Don't take it personal if he says no." Eleanor nodded. She didn't have the luxury of taking anything personal. "How do I find him?" "North Road. Follow it till you see a split-rail fence and a windmill. Can't miss it." He paused. "You got a wagon?" "No." "Horse?" "No." The man's expression softened, just barely. "It's a long walk in this heat." "We'll manage," Eleanor said. She turned and walked out before he could say anything else. They started walking. The sun climbed higher. The road shimmered, throwing up waves of heat that bent the horizon into something unreal. Thomas stumbled twice, and Eleanor caught him each time, her own legs shaking. Lily carried Samuel on her back for the first mile. Then Eleanor took him, his small body limp and hot against her shoulder. No one spoke. There was no breath to spare. When the windmill finally appeared, Eleanor nearly wept. It rose above the plains like a promise, its blades turning slow and lazy in the breeze that didn't reach the ground. Beyond it, she saw a house, low, wide, built from rough timber and stone. A barn, corrals. Cattle scattered across the distance, dark shapes against the yellow grass. A man stood near the barn, his back to the road. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in faded work clothes and a hat pulled low. He moved with the kind of economy that came from years of hard labor, lifting a saddle onto a fence rail without wasted motion. Eleanor set Samuel down and smoothed her dress, a useless gesture. She was covered in dust, her hair falling loose, her face burned raw. But she walked forward anyway, across the yard, past the well, into the shade of the barn where the man worked. "Mr. Granger?" He turned. The first thing she noticed was his eyes, gray, cold, distant. The second was the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stray dog, wary, unsurprised, already preparing to send it away. "Yeah," he said. Eleanor's throat tightened. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm looking for work." He glanced past her at the children standing in the sun. "You come from town?" "Yes." "On foot?" "Yes." He frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. "That's 8 miles." "I know." He turned back to the saddle, adjusting a stirrup. "I don't hire women." Eleanor had expected this. She kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Granger. I can work. I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden. I can do laundry, churn butter, keep house. I don't need much, just enough to feed my children and a place to sleep." "No." The word was flat, final. Eleanor felt the last bit of hope crack. "Please." "No." She opened her mouth to argue, to beg, to say something that would change his mind, but then Samuel made a sound, a soft whimper, and she turned just in time to see him collapse. Lily screamed. Eleanor ran. Samuel lay crumpled in the dirt, his eyes rolled back, his lips blue white. Eleanor dropped to her knees, pulling him into her lap, her hands shaking as she pressed her fingers to his throat. His pulse fluttered, weak and fast. "Samuel!" She patted his cheek, his chest. "Samuel, wake up!" Footsteps. Caleb knelt beside her, his face hard and focused. "How long's he been without water?" Eleanor's voice broke. "We shared a canteen this morning. It's gone." Caleb didn't answer. He scooped Samuel up and carried him to the well, lowering the bucket with one hand and hauling it up full. He soaked a rag and pressed it to the boy's face, his neck, his wrists. Then he tipped the boy's head back and let water trickle into his mouth. Samuel coughed, sputtered, and his eyes opened. Eleanor sobbed. Caleb handed her the rag. "Keep him cool. Get him in the shade." He walked to the house and came back with a tin cup and a jug. He poured water and handed it to Thomas, then Lily, then Eleanor. "Drink slow." Eleanor obeyed, the water so cold it hurt. She watched Caleb's face, searching for softness, for pity, for anything she could use. But there was nothing, just that same hard, distant look. "Mr. Granger, you can stay," he said abruptly. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "You can stay. Work the house, cook, clean. I'll pay you room and board, nothing more. If you steal, you're gone. If you cause trouble, you're gone. If you can't keep up, you're gone." He looked at her directly, and his eyes were stone. "Understood?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "There's a cabin out back," Caleb continued. "Used to be for hired hands. It's not much, but it's got a roof and a stove. You'll take your meals in the main house. Work starts at dawn." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. Caleb turned away. "Don't thank me yet." The cabin was small, dim, and stifling. One room with a narrow bed, a pot-belly stove, a table, and 2 chairs. The windows were covered in dust, the floor littered with mouse droppings. But it had 4 walls and a door that closed, and that was more than Eleanor had hoped for. She set Samuel on the bed and opened the windows, letting in the hot breeze. Lily found a broom in the corner and started sweeping without being asked. Thomas sat on the floor, still drinking water, his face pale. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked out at the ranch, the house, the barn, the endless stretch of land beyond. The sky was so big it made her dizzy, and the silence was so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. She thought of the stagecoach pulling away, leaving them stranded. She thought of every closed door, every turn back, every cold refusal. And she thought of Caleb Granger's eyes, gray and distant and hard, but still, somehow, not cruel. "We'll make this work," she said softly. Lily looked up from sweeping. "Mama?" Eleanor turned. "We'll make this work." Dinner was wordless. Eleanor cooked the first meal in Caleb's kitchen while he sat at the table, silent and watchful. She'd found flour, salt pork, and potatoes in the pantry, and she made something simple: fried potatoes, biscuits, gravy, the kind of food that filled you up without pretending to be more than it was. She set a plate in front of him and waited. Caleb picked up his fork, took a bite, and nodded once. "It's fine." That was all. Eleanor served the children in the cabin, and they ate like they'd been starving, because they had been. She watched them, her heart aching, and promised herself she would never let them go hungry again. After the dishes were done, she walked back to the main house to ask Caleb what he needed from her in the morning. She found him on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the darkening plains. "Mr. Granger." He glanced at her. "Yeah. What time do you want breakfast?" 5. Eleanor nodded. "Anything else?" He was quiet for a moment, smoke curling from his lips. "The house hasn't been kept in a long time. You'll see that tomorrow. Do what you can." "I will." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Hayes." She looked back. Caleb met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something other than coldness. Not warmth exactly, but not indifference either. "Your boy," he said quietly. "Keep him out of the sun till he's stronger." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I will. Thank you." He nodded and turned back to the horizon. Eleanor walked back to the cabin, the night air finally cool against her skin. Inside, the children were already asleep, tangled together on the narrow bed. She sat in one of the chairs and let herself cry, quietly, so they wouldn't hear. She cried for everything she'd lost, for everything she'd survived, for the terror of watching Samuel collapse and the relief of seeing him wake. And she cried because, for the first time in months, they had a roof, a bed, food, water. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was a chance. Morning came before Eleanor was ready. She woke in the chair, stiff and aching, the cabin still dark. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading into pale gray. She stood, stretched, and quietly slipped out the door. The main house was already awake. Light glowed in the kitchen window, and she could see Caleb moving inside, building up the fire in the stove. Eleanor stepped inside, and he looked up. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The kitchen was a disaster. Dishes piled in the basin, the floor sticky with spilled coffee and grease, the stove caked with soot. Eleanor started with the dishes, pumping water from the sink and scrubbing each plate until it gleamed. Caleb made coffee, poured 2 cups, and set one beside her without a word. She glanced at him. "Thank you." He grunted and walked out. By the time the sun rose, Eleanor had cleaned the kitchen, swept the floor, and made breakfast: eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits. She set the table and called Caleb in from the barn. He sat, ate, and didn't speak. Eleanor sat across from him, sipping her coffee, watching him. He had the look of a man who'd forgotten how to live with other people. Every movement was deliberate, contained, separate. She wondered what had happened to his wife. She wondered if he'd loved her. "There's more work than just the kitchen," Caleb said suddenly. Eleanor set down her cup. "Tell me." He stood and led her through the house. It was worse than she'd expected. Dust covered everything: tables, chairs, shelves. The windows were filthy, the floors tracked with mud and manure. Clothes were piled in corners, and the smell of stale air and loneliness hung heavy in every room. "I don't keep it up," Caleb said flatly. Haven't had reason to. Eleanor nodded. I'll take care of it. He looked at her, and for a moment something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude, not trust, but acknowledgement. All right, he said, and then he walked out, leaving her alone in the wreckage of a life he'd stopped living. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room, hands on her hips, and looked around. She thought of the stagecoach, the dust, the heat, the moment Samuel fell, and she thought of Caleb's voice. You can stay. She rolled up her sleeves, and she got to work. Wow. The days blurred together. Eleanor scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She washed windows until her hands were raw. She boiled linens, beat rugs, polished wood. The house fought her at every turn, but she was relentless. Room by room, she brought it back to life. The children helped. Lily swept and dusted. Thomas hauled water from the well. Samuel, still weak, sat in the shade and sorted buttons, folded rags, did small tasks that made him feel useful. Caleb watched from a distance. He never praised, never criticized, but Eleanor noticed things. The way he left tools where she could reach them, the way he brought home extra flour from town, the way he stopped tracking mud across the clean floors. He was careful not to undo her work. That meant something. One evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor found Caleb on the porch again, smoking in the dark. She sat in the chair beside him, uninvited. He glanced at her but didn't speak. Your wife, Eleanor said quietly. What was her name? Caleb was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Anna? Eleanor nodded. How long were you married? 10 years? Did she die here? Yeah. His voice was rough, distant. Fever. Came on fast. Nothing I could do. Eleanor heard the weight in those words. The helplessness. The guilt. I'm sorry, she said. Caleb flicked ash from his cigarette. Why? Because you loved her. He looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor saw the rawness beneath the stone. Yeah, he said. I did. They sat in silence, the night stretching wide around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. You ever loved anyone like that? Caleb asked. Eleanor thought of her husband, a man she'd married because it was expected, because he'd seemed steady and safe. A man who died in a factory accident and left her with 3 children and nothing else. No, she said honestly, I didn't. Caleb nodded, as if that made sense. They didn't speak again, but they sat together until the stars came out, and that was enough. By the end of the second week, the house was transformed. Floors gleamed, windows sparkled, curtains hung clean and white. The smell of lye and lemon replaced the stale air, and the rooms felt open, alive. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, hands on her hips, surveying her work with quiet pride. Caleb walked in, stopped, and looked around. It's different, he said. Eleanor smiled. Is that good or bad? He was quiet for a moment, then, good. That night, he brought her a small sack of coffee beans from town, real coffee, not the cheap stuff. He set it on the table without a word and walked out. Eleanor held the sack in her hands and felt something warm unfold in her chest. She was still a hired hand, still a woman with no claim to this place, but she was no longer invisible, and that was a start. The heat didn't break. If anything, it got worse. By late August, the sky burned white, and the air shimmered like water. The cattle grew restless, bawling for rain that didn't come. The creek shrank to a trickle. Dust storms rolled across the plains, turning day into twilight. Eleanor worked through it all. She hauled water, cooked in the sweltering kitchen, kept the house sealed tight against the dust. The children grew stronger, browner, wilder. They ran barefoot through the yard, chased chickens, climbed the fence rails. Caleb didn't smile, but he stopped frowning when they were near. One afternoon, Eleanor found him in the barn, repairing a bridle. She'd brought him water, and he drank it without looking up. Storm's coming, he said. Eleanor glanced at the sky. It was clear, relentless blue. How do you know? Cattle know. He nodded toward the pasture where the herd was bunched tight, uneasy. They always know. Eleanor watched them, then looked back at Caleb. What do we do? Get everything tied down, bring the children inside, stay low. She nodded and turned to go, but he called her back. Eleanor. She stopped, surprised. He never used her name. He looked at her, his face serious. If it's bad, stay in the house. Don't come looking for me. Her heart stuttered. Why would it be bad? Because summer storms out here don't ask permission. He went back to his work, and Eleanor walked outside, her chest tight. The sky was still blue, but the wind had begun to rise. The storm hit just before midnight. Eleanor woke to the sound of thunder, not distant, but overhead, shaking the cabin. She scrambled out of bed, pulling the children close as the wind howled and the walls groaned. "Mama," Lily cried. "It's all right," Eleanor said, though her own heart was racing. "It's just a storm." But it wasn't just a storm. The wind screamed, the roof rattled, rain came in sheets, pounding the cabin like fists. And then, through the chaos, Eleanor heard something worse. Cattle. Bellowing, panicked, running. She ran to the window and saw them, dark shapes stampeding across the yard, scattering in every direction. And beyond them, a figure on horseback, riding hard into the storm. Caleb. Eleanor's breath caught. He was trying to turn the herd to keep them from running themselves to death. But the wind was too strong, the lightning too close, and the cattle were blind with fear. Eleanor made a decision. She grabbed her shawl, told Lily to watch the boys, and ran out into the storm. The rain hit her like a wall. The wind tore at her clothes, her hair. She could barely see, could barely breathe, but she ran toward the barn, toward the horses. She didn't know how to ride, but she'd watched Caleb. She'd seen him saddle, mount, ride. She could try. She hauled herself onto the nearest horse, grabbed the reins, and kicked hard. The horse bolted. Eleanor held on, her hands slick with rain, her body jarring with every stride. The world was chaos. Wind, rain, lightning, the thunder of hooves. She couldn't see Caleb, couldn't see the herd, but she could hear them. She rode toward the sound, her heart pounding, her voice lost in the storm. And then, through the rain, she saw him. Caleb, on horseback, turning the lead cattle, driving them back toward the corral. His hat was gone, his shirt plastered to his body, but he didn't stop. Eleanor rode up beside him, and he turned, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. "Helping," she shouted back. He stared at her for one long moment, and then he laughed. It was a wild, reckless sound, swallowed by the storm. "Then ride," he yelled. And they did. Together they turned the herd. Together they drove the cattle back through rain and wind and lightning that split the sky. Eleanor's hands bled from the reins. Her body screamed with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. Neither did Caleb. By the time the storm passed, the sky was black and silent. The cattle were penned, battered but alive. Eleanor slid off the horse and collapsed against the fence, gasping. Caleb dismounted beside her, breathing hard. They stood there, soaked and shaking, staring at each other. And then Caleb smiled. It was small, crooked, and half disbelieving, but it was real. "You're insane," he said. Eleanor laughed, breathless. "Probably." He shook his head, still smiling. "You can't even ride." "I learned." He looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in his eyes. Something warm, something human. "Yeah," he said softly. "You did." They walked back to the house together, silent and exhausted, the storm rolling away into the east. And when Eleanor looked up at the sky, she saw the stars coming out. For the first time since she'd arrived, the air felt cool. The drought hadn't broken. But something else had. The morning after the storm, Eleanor woke to silence. Not the oppressive quiet of fear or emptiness, but something gentler, the kind of stillness that came after survival. She lay in the narrow bed with her children curled around her, listening to the birds returning to the eaves, the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of the windmill turning in a breeze that finally didn't burn. Her body ached everywhere. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth where the rains had torn her palms open. Her shoulders throbbed, her thighs screamed from gripping the horse, and when she tried to stand, her legs nearly gave out. But she stood anyway. Outside, the world looked scrubbed clean. The dust had settled, the air smelled of rain and wet grass, and the sky stretched pale blue and endless. Eleanor walked slowly across the yard, her bare feet sinking into mud, and found Caleb already at work near the barn, inspecting the fence rails the wind had torn loose. He looked up when she approached, his eyes moving over her bandaged hands, her limping gait, the way she held herself like someone who'd been thrown from a horse and climbed right back on. "You should be resting," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "So should you." He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he turned back to the fence and pulled a bent nail free with his bare hands. "Cattle made it through. Lost 2 calves to the stampede, but the rest are fine." "That's good." "Yeah." He tossed the nail into a bucket. "Thanks to you." Eleanor felt warmth rise in her chest. "I didn't know what I was doing." "You did it anyway." Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his pants, and looked at her directly. "That counts for something." They stood there in the morning light, 2 people who'd ridden through a storm together and lived to see the other side. Eleanor wanted to say something about fear or trust, or the way her heart had pounded when she'd seen him alone in the chaos. But the words felt too big, too fragile. So instead she said, "I'll make coffee." Caleb nodded. "I'll be in soon." She turned and walked back to the house, her hands trembling slightly, though not from pain. Inside the kitchen, she built up the fire and set the coffee to boil, moving slowly through the familiar motions. Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair tangled, her face soft with sleep. "Mama, is everything all right?" Eleanor pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Go wake your brothers. We'll have breakfast soon." Lily hesitated. "You rode a horse last night." Eleanor looked down at her. "I did." "Thomas said you could have died." "I could have," Eleanor admitted. "But I didn't." Lily's eyes were wide, searching. "Why did you go out there?" Eleanor thought about that, about the moment she'd made the choice, the way her body had moved before her mind could argue. Because Mr. Granger needed help, and because sometimes you do the thing that scares you most when someone you care about is in danger. "Do you care about him?" The question was so simple, so direct, that Eleanor didn't know how to answer. She thought of Caleb's rough hands wrapping her palms, his quiet voice in the dark, the way he'd laughed in the middle of the storm. "I think I'm starting to," she said softly. Lily nodded, as if that made perfect sense, and went to wake her brothers. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen, her heart full of something she couldn't quite name. When Caleb came in for breakfast, the children were already at the table, eating biscuits and gravy with the single-minded focus of the young and hungry. He sat down without a word, and Eleanor set a plate in front of him. Eggs, bacon, potatoes fried crisp. He picked up his fork, paused, and looked at her. "You didn't have to cook, not with your hands like that." "I wanted to." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and began to eat. Thomas, emboldened by a full stomach and the bright morning, leaned forward. "Mr. Granger, can I help you fix the fence?" Caleb glanced at the boy, his expression unreadable. "You know how to use a hammer?" "I can learn." Something shifted in Caleb's face, not quite a smile, but close. "All right, after breakfast." Thomas beamed, and Samuel, not wanting to be left out, piped up. "Can I help too?" "You can hand me nails," Caleb said, "but you stay out of the way." "I will!" Eleanor watched them, her throat tight. Caleb had been alone for so long, locked away in grief and silence. But here he was, letting her children into his world, one small step at a time. After the meal, the boys followed Caleb outside, chattering like magpies. Lily stayed behind to help with the dishes, and Eleanor worked beside her daughter in companionable quiet. "He's not so scary," Lily said after a while. Eleanor smiled. "No, he's not." "Do you think we'll stay here?" The question hung in the air, delicate and dangerous. Eleanor dried her hands carefully, choosing her words. "I don't know, sweetheart, but for now, we have a home. That's more than we had a month ago." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went outside to sit in the sun with a book she'd found in the cabin, a battered copy of fairy tales with half the pages missing. Eleanor finished the dishes and moved through the house, tidying, sweeping, checking the windows for damage from the storm. Everything was intact. The house had held. She found herself in the room that had once belonged to Caleb's wife. Eleanor had cleaned it weeks ago, but she'd done so quickly, efficiently, without really looking. Now, in the clear morning light, she let herself see. The bed was neatly made, covered in a quilt stitched with blue and white stars. A dresser stood against one wall, its surface empty except for a hairbrush with a few strands of dark hair still tangled in the bristles. On the windowsill sat a small glass vase, dusty and forgotten. Eleanor picked up the vase and carried it to the kitchen, washing it carefully before filling it with wildflowers she'd seen growing near the creek. She brought it back and set it on the windowsill, where the light caught the glass and threw soft colors across the wall. It felt like an offering, a way of saying, "I see you. I honor what was here before me." When Caleb came in for lunch, he stopped in the doorway of that room, staring at the vase. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for anger, for grief, for rejection. But Caleb just stood there, silent, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Anna loved wildflowers," he said finally. Eleanor's voice was gentle. "I thought she might." He nodded, once, and walked away. That night, Eleanor sat on the porch steps while the children played in the yard, their laughter bright and unguarded. Caleb joined her, settling onto the step with a tin cup of coffee in his hands. They sat without speaking for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "You ever think about leaving?" Caleb asked. Eleanor turned to look at him. "Leaving here?" "Yeah." She considered the question honestly. "Every day when I first arrived, I thought about taking the children and moving on, finding a town with more opportunity, more people." She paused. "But then I stopped thinking about it." "Why?" "Because we're not just surviving here, we're living." She looked at him. "And because I think you needed us as much as we needed you." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't need anyone." "Maybe not," Eleanor said. "But you're better with us here, and I think you know it." He didn't argue. He just stared out at the darkening land, his face unreadable. "I stopped living when Anna died," he said quietly. "Stopped caring about the house, about myself, about anything except the cattle and the work. Thought that was enough." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were raw. "It wasn't." Eleanor felt her heart crack open. "It never is." "You brought me back," Caleb said. "You and those kids. I didn't want you to, but you did it anyway." She reached out slowly and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was rough, warm, solid. "We brought each other back," she said. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might pull away. But he didn't. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers, holding on. They sat like that until the stars came out, two people who'd survived their own storms learning how to be still together. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Eleanor rose before dawn to make breakfast, and Caleb came in from the barn with his quiet presence and rough gratitude. The children grew browner, stronger, wilder. Thomas learned to mend fences and check cattle. Lily helped Eleanor in the garden, coaxing vegetables from the dry soil. Samuel followed Caleb around like a shadow, asking endless questions that Caleb answered with surprising patience. One afternoon, Eleanor was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats. She turned to see a wagon rolling up the road, driven by an older woman in a severe black dress, her face pinched beneath a bonnet. Caleb emerged from the barn, his expression wary. The woman climbed down from the wagon with the help of a younger man, her son, Eleanor guessed, and approached Caleb with the air of someone on a mission. "Mr. Granger," the woman said crisply. "I'm Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore. This is my son, Gerald. We're from the church committee in Red Hollow." Caleb nodded, his face carefully neutral. "Ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore's sharp eyes swept over the yard, taking in the clean house, the tended garden, the children playing near the well. Her gaze landed on Eleanor, and her mouth thinned. "We've heard you've taken in a woman and her children," she said. "That's right." "Without the benefit of marriage," Caleb's expression hardened. "She works for me. It's a business arrangement." Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "A business arrangement. I see." She looked at Eleanor again, her judgment clear. "Mrs. Hayes, is it?" Eleanor set down the laundry basket and walked over, her chin up. "Yes, ma'am." "And you find this arrangement appropriate?" I find it necessary, Eleanor said evenly. My children and I needed work and shelter. Mr. Granger provided both. I've done nothing improper. Propriety, Mrs. Whitmore said sharply, is not determined by what you've done, but by what others perceive. And I can assure you, Mrs. Hayes, that the people of Red Hollow have noticed your presence here. Tongues are wagging. Eleanor felt heat rise in her face, but before she could respond, Caleb stepped forward. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, I don't give a damn what people are saying. Mrs. Hayes and her children are here because I hired her. What happens on my land is my business. Gerald Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. Now, Mr. Granger, there's no need to be hostile. My mother is simply concerned for the moral standing of the community. Then tell the community to mind its own affairs, Caleb said flatly. Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed. This is precisely the kind of attitude that leads good Christian people astray, Mr. Granger. A man and a woman living in such close quarters without the sanctity of marriage, it's scandalous. They live in separate houses, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. Mrs. Hayes has her own cabin. Her children sleep under her roof. She works during the day and goes home at night. If you or anyone else wants to make something ugly out of that, that's your failing, not mine. Mrs. Whitmore drew herself up. I see you've made your position clear, but I warn you, Mr. Granger, this will not be forgotten. The church takes these matters seriously. Good for the church, Caleb said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Whitmore sputtering. Eleanor met the woman's glare with calm dignity. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Whitmore, but as Mr. Granger said, we're managing just fine. Mrs. Whitmore sniffed, climbed back into her wagon with Gerald's help, and drove away in a cloud of dust and indignation. Eleanor stood in the yard, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with anger and humiliation. Caleb appeared at her side. Don't listen to her. Easy for you to say, Eleanor said tightly. You're a man. Your reputation can survive anything. Your reputation is fine, Caleb said. You're a widow trying to feed her children. Anyone with half a brain can see that. Mrs. Whitmore has a whole brain, Eleanor said, and she's decided I'm a fallen woman. Caleb looked at her, his eyes fierce. You're not fallen. You're standing. That's more than most people can say. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you. He nodded, awkward and gruff. Come on, let's get back to work. That night, Eleanor lay awake in the cabin, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning. She knew how this worked. She'd seen it before. A woman's reputation destroyed by whispers, by speculation, by righteous judgment. It didn't matter that she'd done nothing wrong. It only mattered what people believed. And if Red Hollow turned against her, where would she go? She thought of Caleb's words. You're standing. She was. Barely, but standing nonetheless. She wouldn't let Mrs. Whitmore take that away. The next Sunday, Eleanor dressed her children in their cleanest clothes and walked the 8 miles to Red Hollow for church. She knew people would stare. She knew they'd whisper. But she went anyway, her head high, her children close. The congregation turned as one when she entered, their eyes following her down the aisle. She found a seat near the back and sat with Lily, Thomas, and Samuel pressed against her sides. Mrs. Whitmore sat in the front pew, her back rigid with disapproval. The service began. The pastor spoke of grace, of forgiveness, of loving thy neighbor. Eleanor listened, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. When the service ended, several women approached her, some with genuine warmth, others with thinly veiled curiosity. Mrs. Hayes, how are you settling in? Are the children well? Is Mr. Granger treating you fairly? Eleanor answered each question with patience and honesty. Yes, they were settling in. Yes, the children were well. Yes, Mr. Granger was a fair employer. She did not explain. She did not justify. She simply existed, visible and unashamed. By the time she walked back to the ranch with her children, the sun high and hot overhead, she felt lighter. Let them talk. She had nothing to hide. When she arrived home, Caleb was waiting on the porch, a glass of water in his hand. He handed it to her without a word. Eleanor drank, grateful, and sat beside him on the steps. How was it? He asked. Exactly as I expected. He nodded. You didn't have to go. Yes, I did. Eleanor looked at him. I won't let them make me invisible. Caleb studied her face, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. Good. They sat together in the afternoon heat, and Eleanor felt the weight of the day settle into something manageable. She was still here, still standing, and she wasn't alone. The summer deepened, the heat relentless. The cattle grew lean, the creek dried to a trickle, and the grass turned brittle underfoot. Caleb rode out every day to check the herd, and Eleanor kept the house running, kept the children safe, kept the world from falling apart. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Caleb came into the kitchen and set a small wooden box on the table. Eleanor looked up, surprised. What's this? For you, he said gruffly. She opened the box and found a pair of leather gloves, sturdy, well-made, sized for a woman's hands. Her throat tightened. Caleb, your hands are torn up from the storm, he said. Figured you could use them. Eleanor lifted the gloves, running her fingers over the soft leather. Thank you. He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's nothing. It's not nothing. They stood there in the kitchen, the evening light slanting through the windows, the smell of stew simmering on the stove. Eleanor wanted to say something about kindness, about caring, about the way her heart had started to beat differently when he was near, but instead she just smiled. I'll put them to good use. Caleb nodded and turned to leave, but she called him back. Caleb? He stopped. Stay for dinner, she said. With us, in the cabin. He hesitated, and Eleanor could see the war in his eyes, the habit of solitude fighting against the pull of connection. Finally, he nodded. All right. That night, they ate together around the small table in the cabin, the children chattering and laughing, Caleb quiet but present. Eleanor watched him across the table, saw the way he listened to Thomas's story about catching a lizard, the way he let Samuel lean against his arm, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. And she thought, this is what home feels like. Not a place, not walls or a roof, but people, together, choosing each other, day after day. After dinner, Caleb helped clear the dishes, and the children begged him to tell them a story. He looked at Eleanor, uncertain, and she nodded. So he sat in the chair by the stove and told them about the first time he'd seen a grizzly bear, about riding through a blizzard, about the night the stars fell from the sky in a shower of light. The children hung on every word, their eyes wide. And when the story ended, Samuel climbed into Caleb's lap and fell asleep. Caleb looked down at the boy, his expression soft and bewildered, and Eleanor's heart broke open. He trusts you, she said quietly. Caleb's voice was rough. I don't know why. Because you've earned it. He looked at her, and the distance between them felt suddenly smaller, the air charged with something fragile and new. Eleanor. The sound of hoofbeats outside shattered the moment. Caleb stood, careful not to wake Samuel, and handed the boy to Eleanor. Stay inside. He walked out into the night, and Eleanor followed, her heart pounding. Two men sat on horseback in the yard, silhouetted against the moonlight. One of them dismounted, and Eleanor recognized him, Gerald Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore's son. The other man was older, well-dressed, with the air of someone accustomed to authority. Mr. Granger, Gerald said, this is Judge Carver from Cheyenne. He needs to speak with Mrs. Hayes. Eleanor stepped forward, dread coiling in her stomach. What's this about? Judge Carver looked at her with cold, assessing eyes. Mrs. Hayes, I've been sent by the Thornton family of St. Louis. They've filed a petition for custody of your son, Thomas Hayes. The world tilted. Eleanor's voice came out strangled. What? The Thorntons are your late husband's relatives, the judge continued. They claim that you are unfit to care for the boy and that he would be better served in their household. That's insane, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. Thomas is my son. They have resources, Mrs. Hayes, wealth, standing, a proper home, and they've raised concerns about your current living situation. His gaze flicked to Caleb, then back to her. Living on a remote ranch, working as hired help, residing in unmarried proximity to a man, it doesn't paint a favorable picture. Caleb stepped forward, his voice deadly. She's done nothing wrong? That may be, the judge said, but the law cares about what's best for the child. and I've been ordered to investigate. I'll be staying in Red Hollow for the next week, conducting interviews. After that, I'll make my recommendation to the court. Eleanor felt the ground drop out from under her. You can't take my son. I'm not taking anyone, Mrs. Hayes. Not yet. But I suggest you prepare yourself for the possibility. Judge Carver mounted his horse. Good evening. The two men rode away, leaving Eleanor standing in the yard, her body numb, her mind screaming. Caleb's hand closed around her arm, steadying her. Eleanor. She turned to him, and the fear in her eyes was absolute. They're going to take him. They're going to take my boy. No, Caleb said fiercely. They're not. You don't know that. I do. He pulled her close, his arms solid around her. Because I won't let them. Eleanor buried her face against his chest and let herself break, just for a moment. And Caleb held her, steady and unshakable, while the stars wheeled overhead and the future hung in the balance. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed with her children wrapped around her, listening to their breathing, memorizing the weight of Thomas's head on her shoulder, the way his small hand curled against her ribs. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Judge Carver's cold expression, heard his voice pronouncing judgment on her life, her choices, her worth as a mother. The Thorntons. She barely remembered them, distant relatives of her dead husband, wealthy people who'd never acknowledged her existence when she was married, never offered help when she was widowed and desperate. But now they wanted Thomas. Now they cared. Not because they loved him, because he was a boy, an heir, someone who could carry their name forward. They didn't know him. Didn't know that he was afraid of thunder, but brave in front of his sisters. Didn't know that he loved to work with his hands, that he asked 1,000 questions, that he laughed with his whole body. Didn't know that he'd learned to be a man by watching Caleb Granger mend fences and gentle horses and speak kindly to a 6-year-old boy who handed him bent nails. They wanted to take him into a mansion and turn him into something he wasn't. And the law would let them, because Eleanor had nothing, no money, no position, no husband to make her respectable in the eyes of judges and courts, and people who measured worth in currency instead of love. When dawn finally broke, Eleanor rose and dressed mechanically, her body moving through familiar motions while her mind spun in desperate circles. She made breakfast, set the table, called the children. They came sleepy and rumpled, unaware that their world was about to shatter. Caleb appeared in the doorway just as she was pouring coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his eyes shadowed, his jaw tight. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Children, eat your breakfast. I'll be right back." She followed Caleb out to the porch, where the morning air hung cool and still. He leaned against the railing, his back to the sun, his face in shadow. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what the judge said, about why they're coming after you." "Because I'm poor," Eleanor said bitterly. "Because I have nothing to offer Thomas except love, and apparently that doesn't count. It's more than that." Caleb turned to face her. "It's because you're alone. A woman on her own, working for wages, living on someone else's land. In their eyes, that makes you vulnerable, unfit. So what am I supposed to do?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Become wealthy overnight? Marry someone for appearance's sake?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "Yes," he said finally. Eleanor stared at him. "What?" "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, stark and impossible. Eleanor's heart stumbled. "Caleb, you can't be serious." "I am." He straightened, his expression fierce. "Think about it, Eleanor. If you're married, if you have a stable home, a husband with land and income, the judge has no grounds to take Thomas. The Thorntons can't argue you're unfit if you're a rancher's wife." "That's not a reason to get married," Eleanor whispered. "It's a damn good reason if it keeps your son safe." She looked at him, this man who'd been a stranger 2 months ago, who'd opened his door when no one else would, who'd held her in the dark and promised the world wouldn't take what mattered most. "You don't love me," she said. Caleb flinched. "I care about you. About the children. That's more than most marriages start with." "But it's not love." "No." He met her eyes, unflinching. "It's not. But it's real. And it's enough to stand up in court and tell that judge you have a home, a husband, a future. It's enough to make them back down. Eleanor felt tears burn behind her eyes. And what happens after? When the danger passes? Do we just pretend? We figure it out. Caleb's voice softened. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to let me help you fight. She turned away, gripping the porch railing, her mind reeling. It was insane. Reckless. A marriage of convenience, a legal arrangement, nothing more. But it might save Thomas. I need time to think, she said. You don't have time. The judge is conducting interviews this week. If you're going to do this, it has to be now. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas's small hand in hers, his trusting smile, the way he called her mama like it was the most important word in the world. She thought of losing him. All right, she whispered. I'll marry you. Caleb exhaled, a sound caught between relief and resignation. We'll go to town tomorrow, see the pastor, make it official. Eleanor nodded, numb. He reached out, hesitated, then placed his hand over hers on the railing. It's going to be all right. She wanted to believe him, but all she could feel was the ground shifting beneath her feet, the future rewriting itself into something she didn't recognize. They told the children that afternoon. Lily looked between them with wide, searching eyes. You're getting married? Like, for real? For real, Caleb said. Thomas frowned. But Mama, you said you didn't need a husband. Eleanor knelt in front of him, taking his hands. I don't need one, sweetheart. But sometimes grown-ups make choices to protect the people they love. This is one of those choices. Is someone trying to hurt us? Eleanor's throat tightened. She couldn't lie to him. Some people think you might be better off living somewhere else, with your father's relatives. Thomas's face went pale. I don't want to live somewhere else. I want to stay here. With you. With Mr. Granger. I know, baby. And that's why we're doing this, to make sure you can stay. Samuel, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, tugged on Caleb's sleeve. Does this mean you're going to be our papa? Caleb looked down at the boy, something raw flickering across his face. I suppose it does. Samuel beamed. Good. I like you. Lily studied Caleb with the unsettling perception of a 12-year-old. Do you love our mama? The question landed like a stone in still water. Caleb met Lily's eyes, and Eleanor saw him choose honesty over comfort. I respect her. I care about her and about all of you. That's the truth. But you don't love her. Lily, Eleanor said gently, that's enough. It's all right. Caleb crouched down to Lily's level. You're smart to ask, and you deserve a real answer. No, I don't love your mother the way people talk about in stories, but I'll protect her. I'll stand by her, and I'll do everything I can to keep this family together. That's a promise. Lily considered this, then nodded slowly. Okay. Eleanor felt something break and mend inside her chest at the same time. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor sat alone in the cabin and let herself cry. Not from fear this time, but from the sheer strangeness of it all. She was going to marry a man she barely knew, bind her life to his, stand before witnesses, and make vows that felt both desperately necessary and utterly surreal. She thought of her first marriage, entered into with hope and naivety, ended by an accident in a factory that left her with 3 children and nothing else. The second marriage would be different. No illusions, no romantic promises, just survival, dressed up in legal language. But maybe, she thought, that was more honest than most marriages ever managed to be. The next morning, they rode to Red Hollow in Caleb's wagon, the children squeezed between them on the bench seat. The town was quiet, the heat already pressing down like a hand. Caleb pulled up in front of the small white church, and Eleanor climbed down, her legs unsteady. The pastor was a thin man in his 50s, kind-faced and soft-spoken. He looked surprised when Caleb explained what they wanted. Marriage, he repeated. Today? Today, Caleb confirmed. The pastor glanced at Eleanor, concern in his eyes. Mrs. Hayes, are you certain about this? Eleanor lifted her chin. I am. It's rather sudden. We've been living on the same property for 2 months, Caleb said. We know each other well enough. The pastor hesitated, clearly torn between pastoral duty and personal doubt. I'll need witnesses. We'll find them, Caleb said. They did. The storekeeper and his wife, drawn by curiosity and the promise of gossip. The small group assembled in the church's dim interior, sunlight filtering through dusty windows. Eleanor stood beside Caleb in her plain cotton dress, her hair pinned back, her hands trembling. The children sat in the front pew, solemn and watchful. The pastor opened his worn prayer book and began to read. Eleanor barely heard the words. She was too aware of Caleb standing beside her, solid and quiet, his presence both reassuring and terrifying. When the pastor asked if she took this man as her husband, she forced her voice steady. I do. Caleb's voice was low and certain when his turn came. I do. Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. There was no kiss, no celebration, just the scratch of a pen as they signed the marriage certificate, the storekeeper and his wife adding their names as witnesses. When it was done, Eleanor looked down at her hand and saw the thin gold band Caleb had slipped onto her finger. Simple, unadorned, but undeniably real. She was married. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Jensen, approached with a tight smile. Congratulations, Mrs. Granger. The name felt foreign, borrowed, but Eleanor nodded. Thank you. I'm sure you'll be very happy, Mrs. Jensen continued, though her tone suggested she believed no such thing. Caleb took Eleanor's elbow. We should go. They walked out into the brutal sunlight, and Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in Red Hollow following them. By nightfall, everyone would know. By morning, the gossip would reach Judge Carver. That was the point. They drove back to the ranch in silence, the children unusually quiet. When they arrived, Caleb helped Eleanor down from the wagon, and she stood in the yard looking at the house that was now, legally, her home. I'll move your things into the main house, Caleb said. You and the children. It'll look better if we're under one roof. Eleanor nodded. She'd expected this. A marriage had to look like a marriage. Where will I sleep? Caleb's jaw tightened. Anna's room. It's the biggest, and it's got space for the children. And you? My room, same as always. He met her eyes. This is a legal arrangement, Eleanor. Nothing more. I'm not expecting anything else. Relief and something uncomfortably close to disappointment twisted in her chest. All right. They spent the afternoon moving Eleanor's few possessions into the house, clothes, books, the children's toys. Lily and Thomas explored their new space with cautious excitement, while Samuel raced from room to room, delighted by the sudden expansion of his world. Eleanor stood in Anna's room, her room now, and looked around. The quilt with blue stars, the dresser, the vase of wildflowers still sitting on the windowsill. She felt like an intruder. She would have understood. Eleanor turned to find Caleb in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Would she? Yeah. He stepped into the room, his gaze moving over the familiar space. Anna was practical. She would have seen what you're doing for your kids, and she would have respected it. Eleanor's throat ached. I'll take care of this room. Honor it. I know you will. Caleb turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Eleanor, you're not a replacement. You're something different, and that's all right. He left before she could respond. That night they ate dinner together at the big table in the main house, a real family, at least in appearance. The children chattered about their new rooms, their new home, the way everything felt both strange and right. After the meal, Caleb excused himself to check the cattle, and Eleanor cleaned up with Lily's help. When the kitchen was spotless, she tucked the children into bed in the room they now shared, reading them a story until their eyes grew heavy. Samuel was the last to drift off, his small hand clutching the edge of her sleeve. Mama? Yes, sweetheart? Are we really safe now? Eleanor's heart clenched. Yes, baby, we're safe. She hoped it was true. Later, alone in Anna's room, her room, Eleanor changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring on her finger. Outside, she could hear the night sounds, cattle lowing, the windmill creaking. the endless whisper of wind across the plains. She thought about Caleb, somewhere in the house, alone in his own room. Her husband. The words still felt impossible. A soft knock on the door startled her. "Come in." Caleb stood in the hallway, still fully dressed, his face shadowed. "Just wanted to make sure you had everything you need." "I'm fine." He nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. "Eleanor, I know this isn't what you wanted, but I meant what I said to Lily. I'll stand by you, whatever happens." Eleanor stood and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from him. "Why are you doing this, Caleb? Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "Because when Anna died, I stopped believing there was any point in caring about anything. And then you showed up, half dead from the heat, with 3 kids and more courage than sense, and you woke something up. I don't know what to call it, but I'm not ready to let it go." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know what to call it either." "Then we'll figure it out together." He reached out slowly and touched her cheek, just a brief, careful brush of his fingers. Then he stepped back, turned, and disappeared down the hall. Eleanor stood alone in the doorway, her heart racing, her skin still warm where he'd touched her. This wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. And maybe, she thought, that was enough to build on. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of normalcy and tension. Eleanor ran the household, cooked meals, tended the garden. Caleb worked the ranch, his presence steady and constant. The children adjusted to their new rooms, their new routines, the subtle shift from hired help to family. On the 4th day, Judge Carver returned. Eleanor saw him coming from the kitchen window, his horse kicking up dust on the long road, his posture rigid and formal. Her stomach dropped. "Caleb!" she called. He appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing when he saw the approaching rider. "Stay calm," he said quietly as he joined her on the porch. "We're married. Legally. He can't take Thomas." Eleanor nodded, her mouth dry. Judge Carver dismounted and approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Granger, Mrs. Granger." The name still jarred Eleanor, but she held her ground. "Judge, I've completed my investigation," he said. "I've spoken to townspeople, church members, and reviewed your recent marriage certificate." Eleanor's heart pounded. "And?" "The Thorntons are unhappy with this development," Judge Carver continued. "They've argued that the marriage is a sham, entered into solely to prevent their custody claim." Caleb stepped forward, his voice hard. "The Thorntons can argue whatever they want. Eleanor is my wife. This is her home. Those children are under my protection." Judge Carver studied him for a long moment. "I've seen many marriages in my time, Mr. Granger. Some born of love, some of convenience, some of desperation. But I've also seen the way children thrive in stable homes, and the way they wither when they're torn from the people who love them." He turned to Eleanor. "Your son Thomas. I spoke with him yesterday." Eleanor's breath caught. "You did?" "I asked him where he wanted to live. Do you know what he said?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "He said here, with my mama and Mr. Granger and my brother and sister, because this is home." Judge Carver's expression softened, just barely. "Children know the truth, Mrs. Granger. Better than we do, sometimes." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I'll be filing my recommendation with the court that Thomas Hayes remain in his mother's custody," the judge said. "The Thorntons won't like it, but unless they can prove genuine unfitness, which they cannot, the boy stays here." Eleanor's knees nearly gave out. Caleb's hand found her elbow, steadying her. "Thank you," she whispered. Judge Carver nodded. "You've built something here, Mrs. Granger. Don't let anyone tell you it's not enough." He mounted his horse. "Good day." He rode away, leaving Eleanor and Caleb standing on the porch, the morning sun warming their faces. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor turned and buried her face against Caleb's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her while she shook with relief and exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "He's safe," she choked out. "Thomas is safe." "I told you," Caleb said quietly. "I wouldn't let them take him." Eleanor pulled back, looking up at him through tears. You kept your promise. Yeah. His eyes were soft, open in a way she'd never seen. I did. She reached up slowly and touched his face. The scar, the rough stubble, the lines carved by years of grief and solitude. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb's hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm against his cheek. Eleanor, Mama! They sprang apart as Thomas came running from the barn, Lily and Samuel close behind. Did the judge leave? What did he say? Eleanor knelt down, gathering Thomas into her arms. You're staying, sweetheart. You're staying with me. Thomas clung to her, his small body trembling. I told him I wanted to stay. I told him you were the best mama. You were very brave, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. Lily and Samuel crowded close, and Eleanor held all three of them, her children, her whole world. When she looked up, Caleb was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read, longing, maybe, or grief for something he'd lost and was only now beginning to remember. Mr. Granger? Samuel tugged on his sleeve. Are you happy we get to stay? Caleb's throat worked. He crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes. Yeah, son, I'm happy. Samuel hugged him, unselfconscious and trusting, and Caleb's arms came around the small body automatically. Eleanor watched, her heart full to bursting, as the man who'd been so determined to keep the world at arm's length let a 6-year-old boy crack him wide open. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor found Caleb on the porch again, his usual refuge. She sat beside him in the gathering dark, and they listened to the night settling in around them. What happens now? Eleanor asked softly. Caleb turned to look at her. What do you mean? We're married. The threat is gone. Do we just go on pretending? Is that what we're doing? Pretending? Eleanor searched his face. I don't know. Are we? Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful, uncertain. When I asked you to marry me, I meant what I said. It was for practical reasons, legal protection. He paused. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like pretending. Eleanor's breath caught. For me, too. They sat in the dark, the truth hanging between them like something fragile and new. I don't know how to do this, Caleb admitted. I loved Anna. When she died, I thought that was it. I thought I'd buried that part of myself with her. Maybe you did, Eleanor said. But people can grow new parts, different parts. He looked at her, and in the starlight, she saw vulnerability and fear and something that might eventually become love. I'm not there yet, he said, but I think I could be, if you're willing to wait. Eleanor reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. I waited 2 months for you to let me in the door, Caleb Granger. I think I can wait a little longer for your heart. He smiled then, a real smile, slow and wondering. You're something else, Eleanor. So are you. They sat together under the stars, two people who'd married for survival, learning how to build something that might, against all odds, look like a life worth living. The weeks that followed Judge Carver's departure settled into something Eleanor had never quite experienced before. Not happiness, exactly, but the quieter cousin of it. Peace, maybe. Or the beginning of it. She woke each morning in Anna's room with sunlight streaming through the curtains she'd washed and rehung, and she no longer felt like an intruder. The children's breathing from the small beds Caleb had built filled the space with life, and when she dressed and went to the kitchen, Caleb was already there, building up the fire, the coffee already brewing. They didn't talk much in those early hours, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers forced together by circumstance, but something more comfortable. The quiet of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms and didn't need words to fill every moment. One morning, about 3 weeks after the judge's visit, Eleanor was kneading bread dough when Caleb came in from the barn earlier than usual. His face was troubled. What's wrong? She asked, wiping flour from her hands. Cattle are restless. Something's got them spooked. He poured himself coffee, his movements tense. Could be wolves. Could be nothing. But I'm going to ride out, check the herd. Eleanor nodded. How long will you be gone? Most of the day, probably. He hesitated, then added, If I'm not back by dark, don't worry. Sometimes it takes longer to find what's bothering them. Be careful. He looked at her, something soft flickering in his eyes. Always am. But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he crossed the kitchen and did something he'd never done before. He kissed her forehead, brief and careful, before walking out. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand rising to touch the spot where his lips had been. It wasn't passion, it wasn't even romance, but it was intentional. It was care. It was a beginning. She went back to her bread, kneading harder than necessary, her heart doing strange things in her chest. The day stretched long and hot. Eleanor kept the children busy with chores and lessons, but her mind kept drifting to Caleb out there alone, tracking whatever had disturbed the cattle. Oh. By late afternoon, storm clouds had begun to gather on the western horizon, dark and threatening. Lily noticed her mother's worried glances at the sky. "He'll be all right, Mama. Mr. Granger knows this land." "I know, sweetheart." Eleanor smoothed her daughter's hair. "But that doesn't stop me from worrying." "Because you love him?" Eleanor's hand stilled. "I care about him very much." "That's not the same thing." "No," Eleanor admitted. "It's not." Lily studied her with those two old eyes. "But maybe it could be?" Eleanor pulled her daughter close. "Maybe." By the time darkness fell, Caleb still hadn't returned. The storm that had threatened all afternoon broke just after sunset, rain hammering the roof, wind rattling the windows. Eleanor put the children to bed with reassurances she didn't quite feel, then stood at the kitchen window, straining to see through the sheets of rain. Nothing. Just darkness and water and the terrible uncertainty of waiting. She made fresh coffee, though she couldn't drink it, paced the kitchen, checked on the children 3 times, and still, no Caleb. When the door finally opened near midnight, Eleanor nearly collapsed with relief. Caleb stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, mud-splattered, exhausted. "You're back," she breathed. "Yeah." He stepped inside, pulling off his dripping hat. "Sorry, took longer than I thought." "What was it? What spooked them?" "Mountain lion. Big one." He accepted the towel she handed him, wiping his face. "Tracked it about 10 miles north. It had killed a calf. I couldn't leave it out there." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "You went after a mountain lion? Alone?" "Had to. Can't lose cattle to predators." He saw her expression and his face softened. "I'm fine, Eleanor. Been doing this for years. That doesn't make it less dangerous." "No," he agreed, "but it's part of the work." She wanted to argue, to tell him he should have waited, should have brought help, should have done anything except risk himself. But she also understood that this was his land, his responsibility, his way of protecting what mattered. "You're shivering," she said instead. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Caleb nodded and headed for his room. Eleanor heated water and made him soup, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. When he emerged 20 minutes later in dry clothes, his hair still damp, she set a steaming bowl in front of him. He ate in silence, and she sat across from him, watching the exhaustion line his face. "Eleanor," he said finally, setting down his spoon. "You didn't have to wait up." "Yes, I did." He looked at her, really looked, and she saw him understand what she couldn't quite say, that the waiting had been agony, that the thought of him hurt or lost had made her chest tight with fear, that somewhere along the way he'd become necessary to her. "I'm sorry I worried you," he said quietly. "Just, next time tell me before you go chasing mountain lions into the wilderness." "Yes, ma'am." A small smile tugged at his mouth. They sat together in the lamplight kitchen, the storm easing outside, and Eleanor felt the space between them grow smaller by degrees. "You should sleep," she said eventually. "You're dead on your feet." Caleb stood, then hesitated. "Eleanor, that thing I did this morning, before I left." Her cheeks warmed. "The kiss?" "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable. "I didn't ask permission, I just did it." "I know." "Was that all right?" Eleanor stood and crossed to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, the way his breath caught when she reached up to touch his face. "It was more than all right," she said softly. Caleb's hand came up to cover hers, and for a long moment they stood like that, teetering on the edge of something neither of them quite knew how to name. Then Caleb stepped back, careful and deliberate. I should let you sleep too. Eleanor nodded, swallowing disappointment and relief in equal measure. Good night, Caleb. Good night. She watched him disappear down the hallway, then stood alone in the kitchen, her heart racing, her skin still warm from his touch. Slow, she reminded herself. They were moving slow, building something real instead of rushing into something that would burn out fast, but waiting was harder than she'd expected. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. She turned to see 3 riders coming up the long road, 2 men and a woman, all well-dressed, all carrying themselves with the unmistakable air of wealth and authority. Her blood ran cold. The Thorntons. Caleb emerged from the barn, his face hardening the moment he saw them. He crossed the yard to stand beside Eleanor, his presence solid and protective. The lead rider dismounted, a silver-haired man in his 60s, his face lined and stern. Mr. Granger, Mrs. Granger. Mr. Thornton, Caleb said flatly. What brings you to my property? I think you know. Thornton's eyes moved to Eleanor, cold and assessing. We've come to see the boy. Eleanor's voice came out stronger than she felt. Thomas is my son. The judge ruled in my favor. The judge, Thornton said, made his decision based on incomplete information. We've since discovered certain irregularities about your marriage. Oh, Caleb stepped forward. There are no irregularities. We're legally married. You saw the certificate. The woman rider, Mrs. Thornton, Eleanor assumed, spoke up, her voice sharp as glass. A marriage entered into mere days before the judge's investigation. Anyone can see it was a fraud designed to circumvent our claim. You have no claim, Eleanor said, her hands clenching. Thomas is my son. I've raised him, cared for him, loved him every day of his life. You're strangers to him. We're his family, Thornton said, his blood, and we can provide him with opportunities you never could, education, position, a future befitting a Thornton heir. He has a future here, Caleb said, his voice dangerous. And unless you have new legal standing, you're trespassing on my land. The third rider, a younger man with a lawyer's calculating eyes, spoke for the first time. We filed an appeal with the territorial court. We have evidence that this marriage is fraudulent, that Mrs. Granger has been living in moral impropriety, and that the child would be better served in our care. Eleanor felt the world tilt. You can't do this. The judge already decided. Judges can be wrong, Mrs. Thornton interrupted, and they can be influenced. We have resources, Mrs. Granger, connections, and we will use every advantage to ensure that boy receives the life he deserves. The life he deserves is with his mother, Caleb said, his fists clenched. Thornton's expression didn't change. We'll see what the court says. In the meantime, we'd like to see Thomas. Speak with him. No, Eleanor said immediately. You can't prevent us from seeing our nephew. He's not your nephew in any way that matters, Eleanor shot back. And I won't have you confusing him, manipulating him, trying to turn him against the only home he's ever known. The lawyer stepped forward. Mrs. Granger, I strongly advise you to cooperate. Preventing family contact will not look favorable when we return to court. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but Caleb's hand found hers squeezing gently. She looked at him and saw the calculation in his eyes, the strategic thinking. 10 minutes, Caleb said. You can see him, speak with him, but Eleanor and I stay present the entire time. And if he gets upset, you leave. Understood? Thornton nodded stiffly. Acceptable. Eleanor wanted to refuse, to send them away, to protect Thomas from these people who wanted to take him. But she also knew Caleb was right. Denying them access would only fuel their arguments about her unfitness. She went inside and found Thomas in the main room, playing with Samuel. Her heart clenched at how young he looked, how innocent. Thomas, sweetheart, there are some people here to see you. He looked up, curious. Who? Your father's uncle and aunt, the Thorntons. His face went pale. The ones who want to take me away? Eleanor knelt beside him. They can't take you, but they want to talk to you for a few minutes. Mr. Granger and I will be right there. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say, all right? Thomas nodded, his small hand gripping hers tightly. They walked outside together, and Eleanor felt Thomas press closer to her side when he saw the strangers. The Thorntons had dismounted and stood waiting, their expressions carefully neutral. "Thomas," Mr. Thornton said, his voice gentling, "I'm your Uncle Richard. This is your Aunt Constance. We knew your father when he was young." Thomas said nothing, just stared. Mrs. Thornton stepped forward, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You look so much like him. You have his eyes." "I have my mama's eyes," Thomas said quietly. A flash of irritation crossed Mrs. Thornton's face. "Of course, but there's definitely a Thornton resemblance." She paused. "We've come a long way to see you, Thomas. We want you to know that you have family who cares about you, who wants to give you every opportunity." "I have family," Thomas said. "I have my mama and my brother and sister and Mr. Granger." Richard Thornton crouched down, trying to meet Thomas at eye level. "We can offer you so much, son. A fine home, the best schools, travel, culture, things a boy needs to become a gentleman." "I'm learning things here," Thomas said. "Mr. Granger teaches me about the ranch. Mama teaches me reading and writing. I don't need to be a gentleman." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride. Constance Thornton's patience was clearly wearing thin. "You're too young to understand what's best for you, but we do. We know what your father would have wanted." "My father's dead," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "And he left us with nothing. Mr. Granger took us in when nobody else would. He's more family than you are." "Thomas," Richard said sharply, his veneer of kindness cracking, "you will show respect." "Time's up," Caleb said, stepping between Thomas and the Thorntons. "You've had your 10 minutes. This isn't over," Constance said coldly. "We'll be back, with the law on our side." "Looking forward to it," Caleb said flatly. The Thorntons mounted their horses, the lawyer giving Eleanor one last calculating look before they rode away. The moment they were gone, Thomas burst into tears. Eleanor gathered him up, holding him tight while he sobbed against her shoulder. "I don't want to go with them, Mama. I don't want to leave." "You're not going anywhere, baby. I promise." But as she held her son, Eleanor met Caleb's eyes over Thomas's head, and she saw the worry there. The Thorntons had money, power, connections. They'd already filed an appeal. This wasn't over. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Eleanor and Caleb sat at the kitchen table, a lamp burning low between them. "They're not going to give up," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "They'll keep fighting until they get what they want." "Then we fight harder," Caleb said. "With what? We have no money for lawyers, no connections, nothing to match what they can bring to bear." Her voice broke. "How do we fight people like that?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, disappeared into his room, and returned with a small wooden box. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside were papers, deeds, certificates, bank records. "This ranch," Caleb said, "is worth more than you think. It's 2,000 acres, free and clear. I've got a herd of 500 cattle, water rights to the creek, mineral rights to the land. I've been saving for years, never had anything to spend it on after Anna died." He pulled out a bank book. "There's $12,000 in the Cheyenne Bank." Eleanor stared at him. "Caleb, I can't take your money. It's not just my money anymore. You're my wife. Legally, it's ours." He met her eyes. "And I'm willing to spend every penny of it if that's what it takes to keep Thomas here." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "Why? Why would you do that?" Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. "Because that boy belongs with his mother. Because your family has become—" He paused, searching for words. "Because you matter to me, Eleanor. All of you. And I'm done standing by while the world tries to take away the things that matter." Eleanor stood and moved around the table, and before she could second-guess herself, she wrapped her arms around him. Caleb froze for a heartbeat, then his arms came up, holding her close. They stood like that in the lamplight kitchen, two people who'd married as strangers learning what it meant to stand together. "We'll hire a lawyer," Caleb said against her hair. "A good one, from Cheyenne or Denver if we have to, and we'll fight this properly." Eleanor pulled back just enough to look at him. "You really mean it?" "Every word." She kissed him then, Not on the forehead, not careful or tentative, but on the mouth, firm and sure and grateful. Caleb made a surprised sound, then kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her face. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor saw wonder in his eyes. "Eleanor, I know," she said quickly. "I know we're taking this slow. I know you're not ready, but I needed you to know. I'm falling for you, Caleb Granger, and I don't think I can stop it." Caleb's thumb traced her cheekbone, his eyes searching hers. "What if I don't want you to stop?" Her breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, I think I've been falling for you too. I've been fighting it, telling myself it was too soon, that I was betraying Anna's memory. But the truth is, I look forward to seeing you every morning. I worry about you when you're upset. I want to protect you and those kids with everything I have." He swallowed hard. "That's not duty, Eleanor. That's something else." "Love?" she whispered. "Maybe. Or the beginning of it." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth. "I'm not good at this. Haven't been for a long time. But I want to try. With you." Eleanor felt joy bloom in her chest, warm and bright and terrifying. "We'll try together." They kissed again, slower this time, learning each other, and Eleanor felt the last wall between them start to crumble. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Should probably get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. We're riding to Cheyenne to find that lawyer." Eleanor nodded. "Together." "Together," he agreed. They walked down the hallway, and when they reached Eleanor's door, Caleb paused. "Good night, Eleanor." She smiled. "Good night, Caleb." But neither of them moved, and Eleanor saw the question in his eyes, the same question that was burning in her own chest. "Stay," she said softly. "Just stay with me tonight. We don't have to. I just don't want to be alone." Caleb's expression softened. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He followed her into the room, and they lay down together on top of the quilt, fully clothed, careful, and uncertain. Caleb's arm came around her, and Eleanor rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "This all right?" he murmured. "Perfect," she whispered. And for the first time since the Thorntons had appeared, Eleanor felt safe. They rode to Cheyenne 3 days later, leaving the children with Mrs. Jensen from the general store, who'd softened considerably since the wedding. The journey took most of a day, the landscape rolling past in shades of gold and brown under an endless sky. Eleanor had never been to Cheyenne. The city overwhelmed her. So many buildings, so many people, the noise and bustle and energy of civilization. But Caleb navigated it with quiet confidence, leading her to the office of Samuel Winters, a lawyer who came highly recommended. Winters was a tall man in his 40s, sharp-eyed and direct. He listened to their story without interruption, making notes, asking pointed questions. "The Thorntons have filed their appeal," he confirmed, reviewing the papers they'd brought. "They're arguing fraud, moral impropriety, and unfitness. It's a weak case, but they have money and influence. That counts for something." "Can we fight it?" Eleanor asked. Winters studied her, then Caleb. "Yes, but it won't be easy or cheap. We'll need to prove the legitimacy of your marriage, demonstrate that the home you've built is stable and appropriate for the children, and ideally, we'd want character witnesses who can testify to your fitness as a mother." "How much will it cost?" Caleb asked. Winters named a figure that made Eleanor's stomach drop, but Caleb just nodded. "Done. What do you need from us?" They spent the next 2 hours going over details, strategies, potential witnesses. By the time they left Winter's office, Eleanor's head was spinning, but she also felt something she hadn't in weeks. Hope. "He thinks we can win," she said, as they walked back to the wagon. "We will win," Caleb said firmly. "I won't let them take him, Eleanor." She slipped her hand into his, and he squeezed it gently. On the ride home, as the sun began to set and the sky turned gold and pink, Eleanor leaned against Caleb's shoulder and let herself imagine a future where this was over, where Thomas was safe, where she and Caleb could just be. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. "The future," Eleanor said. "What it might look like when we're not fighting anymore." "What do you see?" She smiled. "You and me still running this ranch. The children growing up strong and free. Maybe, she hesitated, maybe more children someday. Caleb's arm tightened around her. You want more children? I don't know, maybe. Would you? He was quiet for a long time. With Anna, I wanted kids. We tried. It never happened. After she died, I figured that part of my life was over. He looked down at Eleanor. But with you? Yeah, I think I would. Eleanor's heart swelled. Not yet. Not until this is settled. But someday? Someday, Caleb agreed. They rode in comfortable silence, the stars beginning to emerge overhead, and Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but the promise of it. 2 weeks later, they stood in the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, facing the Thorntons across a crowded courtroom. Eleanor wore her best dress, her hair neatly pinned, her hands trembling in her lap. Beside her, Caleb sat solid and steady, his presence an anchor. Samuel Winters had done his job well. He'd gathered witnesses, the pastor who'd married them, Mrs. Jensen who'd seen how the children thrived, even Judge Carver himself, who testified that he'd observed a genuine family unit and stood by his original recommendation. The Thorntons' lawyer argued fraud, convenience, impropriety. But when Thomas was called to testify, when the judge asked him directly where he wanted to live, the boy's answer was clear and unwavering. With my mama and Mr. Granger. That's my home. Eleanor watched the Thorntons' faces harden, watched their lawyer scramble for counterarguments, watched the judge's expression grow increasingly unsympathetic to their claims. When the gavel finally came down, when the judge ruled that Thomas would remain in Eleanor's custody and that the Thorntons' appeal was denied, Eleanor felt something break loose in her chest, relief so powerful it was almost painful. Caleb's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. It's over, he murmured. It's really over. Eleanor turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him right there in the courtroom, not caring who saw. Outside in the bright afternoon sun, they found Thomas waiting with Mrs. Jensen. The moment he saw them, he ran into Eleanor's arms. You won? He asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. We won, Eleanor confirmed. You're staying with us, baby, forever. Thomas pulled back, his face wet with tears, and threw his arms around Caleb's waist. Thank you, Mr. Granger. Thank you for keeping us together. Caleb's eyes were suspiciously bright as he hugged the boy back. You're welcome, son. And just like that, everything changed. The ride back to the ranch felt different from every other journey Eleanor had made. The same road, the same dust, the same endless Wyoming sky stretching overhead, but everything had changed. Thomas sat between her and Caleb on the wagon bench, chattering about what he'd tell his siblings, while Eleanor kept one hand on her son's shoulder as if to prove to herself he was really still there, really still hers. Caleb drove with one hand on the reins, the other resting against Eleanor's back, a touch so natural and easy it took her breath away. They'd crossed some invisible line in that courtroom, shed the last pretense that this was merely a legal arrangement. Whatever they'd built over these months of heat and storms and desperate choices had become real in a way that had nothing to do with judges or documents. When the ranch finally came into view, Lily and Samuel came running from the house where Mrs. Jensen had been minding them, their faces bright with questions. Thomas jumped down before the wagon even stopped, shouting the news. We won! The judge said, I get to stay! I get to stay forever! Samuel launched himself at his brother, nearly knocking him over, while Lily stood back with tears streaming down her face. Eleanor climbed down and gathered all three children close, holding them like she'd wanted to hold them through every terrifying moment of the past weeks. We're safe now, she whispered. We're all safe. Mrs. Jensen approached, her usually stern face soft. I'm glad for you, Mrs. Granger, truly glad. Those children belong here. Anyone with eyes can see that. Eleanor looked up at her. Thank you for watching them, for everything. Mrs. Jensen nodded, then surprised Eleanor by taking her hand. I misjudged you when you first came to town, thought you were running from something, looking for an easy way. But you've earned your place here. You've earned everything you've got. The words, coming from a woman who'd once been her harshest critic, meant more than Eleanor could express. She squeezed Mrs. Jensen's hand, throat too tight for speech. After Mrs. Jensen left, Caleb unhitched the horses while Eleanor herded the children inside. But instead of the usual chaos, the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if the threat that had hung over them had been pressing down on the very walls. That evening, Eleanor cooked a celebratory dinner. Nothing fancy, just fried chicken and biscuits and gravy. But she made a berry cobbler with the last of the preserves, and they ate at the big table with all the lamps lit, the children laughing and talking over each other. Caleb sat at the head of the table, and Eleanor realized with a start that this was what family looked like. Not the desperate survival they'd been managing, but actual family, messy and loud and full of love that had grown from nothing, from dirt and dust and determination. After dinner, Thomas asked Caleb to tell another story about the old days, and they all moved to the porch where the evening air had finally turned cool. Caleb settled into his chair with Samuel on one knee and began talking about his first cattle drive, about getting lost in a dust storm, about the time a horse threw him into a creek. Eleanor sat on the porch steps with Lily beside her, listening to Caleb's low voice weave the tale, watching the way Thomas hung on every word. This man who'd been so locked away in grief and silence had opened up to her children, had let them crack him wide open, and the sight of it made her chest ache with something too big to name. When the stars came out and the children's eyes grew heavy, Eleanor took them inside and tucked them into bed. Samuel was asleep before she finished the first verse of the lullaby. Thomas held on a little longer, his hand gripping hers. "Mama, are you happy here?" Eleanor smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Very happy, sweetheart. Are you?" "Yes. I like Mr. Granger. I like helping with the ranch. I like having space to run." He paused. "Do you love him?" The question was so direct, so earnest, that Eleanor couldn't deflect. "I do, yes." "Does he love you?" "I think so. We're still figuring it out." Thomas considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than 9. "That's okay. Sometimes the best things take time." Eleanor kissed his forehead, marveling at her son's wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart," Thomas said, grinning. "You just never asked before." She laughed and left him to sleep, checking on Lily, who was already breathing deep and even. When Eleanor emerged onto the porch, Caleb was still sitting there, staring out at the dark land. She settled into the chair beside him, and for a long moment they just sat in comfortable silence. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally, "for everything, for taking us in, for marrying me, for fighting for Thomas, for all of it." Caleb turned to look at her, his face shadowed but his eyes catching the starlight. "You don't have to thank me, Eleanor. This family, you and those kids, you saved me as much as I saved you." "I don't think that's true." "It is." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I was barely living before you showed up, just going through the motions, working myself to exhaustion so I wouldn't have to feel anything. You reminded me what it was like to have something worth protecting, worth caring about." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I was so scared when I stepped off that stagecoach. I had 3 children, no money, no prospects, and I was about to beg for work from a man I'd never met. I thought I'd hit the lowest point possible. And instead I found home." She looked at him. "I found you." Caleb stood and pulled her to her feet, drawing her close. "I need to tell you something. Something I've been trying to work up the courage to say for weeks now." Eleanor's heart hammered. "What is it?" "I love you." The words came out rough, unpracticed, but absolutely certain. "I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you rode out into that storm. Maybe when you stood up to Mrs. Whitmore. Maybe the first morning I saw you making coffee in my kitchen, like you belonged there. But it happened. And I need you to know that this, us, it's not just about keeping up appearances anymore. It's real for me." Eleanor's breath caught. "It's real for me too. I love you, Caleb. I think I have for a while now." He kissed her then, deep and sure, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. Eleanor kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding in, the fear and relief and joy and desperate, growing love that had taken root in the hardest soil imaginable. When they broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Come to bed with me tonight. Really, with me. Not just sleeping side by side, but be my wife in every way. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Are you sure? Never been more sure of anything. She took his hand and let him lead her inside, down the hallway to his room, a space she'd cleaned but never entered otherwise. It was sparse, masculine, but when Caleb lit the lamp, she saw small changes. Fresh curtains on the window, a quilt she'd made folded at the foot of the bed, signs that he'd been preparing for this, hoping for it. They came together with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings, of two people learning each other slowly and carefully. Caleb touched her like she was a miracle, like he couldn't quite believe she was real and willing and his. Eleanor discovered the geography of his body, the scars, the calluses, the strength that came from years of hard work. They made love as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who'd survived separate storms finding shelter in each other. And when they finally lay tangled together in the dark, Eleanor felt something settle deep in her bones. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not rescue, not safety, but partnership. Someone who saw her fully and chose her anyway. I want more of this, Caleb murmured against her hair. More mornings waking up beside you, more evenings on the porch, more of watching you with the kids, hearing you laugh, seeing you make this house into a home. Eleanor pressed closer. Then we'll have it, all of it. I want to give you more too. Not just the ranch, but I want to build something bigger, expand the herd, maybe hire some help so you're not working yourself to death. I want the kids to have opportunities, schooling when they're old enough, chances to become whatever they want to be. They already have everything they need, Eleanor said. They have love and stability and a father who cares about them. That's more than most children get. Caleb was quiet for a moment. A father. Is that what I am to them? Yes, if you want to be. I do, he said softly. Anna and I never had children. I'd accepted that part of my life was over. But Thomas, Lily, Samuel, they don't replace anything. There's something new, something I didn't know I needed. Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks. They need you too. Samuel especially. He follows you everywhere like a shadow. Smart kid, Caleb said, a smile in his voice. Knows who to learn from. They lay together until sleep claimed them, wrapped in each other and the quiet certainty that what they'd built would last. The weeks that followed were the happiest Eleanor could remember. Summer's brutal heat finally broke, giving way to golden September days and cool nights. The ranch thrived under Caleb's steady hand and Eleanor's organization. The children grew brown and strong and free, their laughter echoing across the land. Thomas took to ranch work like he'd been born to it, rising before dawn to help Caleb with the cattle. Lily discovered she had a gift for gardening and coaxed vegetables from the dry soil with patient determination. Samuel remained everyone's shadow, asking endless questions and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Eleanor found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She'd always been adaptable, survival had demanded it, but this was different. This wasn't just adapting to circumstances. This was choosing a life, choosing this place, choosing Caleb over and over again in 100 small daily moments. One October afternoon, Eleanor was in the kitchen preserving the last of the garden harvest when Caleb came in earlier than usual, his face troubled. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Nothing's wrong exactly, but can you come outside for a minute? She wiped her hands and followed him to the yard, where she saw a wagon approaching. Her stomach clenched with old fear. Visitors still made her nervous, made her think of judges and custody claims, but Caleb's hand found hers steady and reassuring. The wagon pulled up, and an elderly couple climbed down. The woman had kind eyes and silver hair, and the man moved with the careful stiffness of arthritis. Mr. and Mrs. Granger? The woman asked. I'm Martha Simmons. This is my husband, Henry. We heard about you from Judge Carver. Eleanor's grip on Caleb's hand tightened. What about? Martha's face creased into a warm smile. Nothing bad, dear. Quite the opposite. You see, we run a small orphanage in Laramie. We've been doing it for 20 years, giving homes to children who have nowhere else to go. But we're getting old and we're looking for good families to place some of our children with. Judge Carver spoke very highly of you both, said you'd fought hard to keep your family together, and that you'd built a real home here. Caleb frowned slightly. We appreciate that, but we're not looking to take in more children right now. Oh, I understand completely, Martha said quickly. I'm not here to pressure you, but I wanted to meet you, see the ranch, and perhaps leave you with some information. You see, we have 3 children, siblings, who desperately need a home together. Too many families want to split them up, take just 1 or 2. But these children have already lost so much, they need to stay together. Eleanor felt her heart twist. How old are they? 7, 5, and 3. A boy and 2 girls. Their parents died in a fire last winter. They've been with us since, but they need more than an orphanage can give them. They need a family. Eleanor looked at Caleb and saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd only just found their footing, only just built stability. Taking on 3 more children would be chaos, would stretch their resources, would change everything, but they'd been those desperate children once. Eleanor had stood in the dust of Red Hollow with no options left. Caleb had been the one to say yes when everyone else said no. Can we meet them? Eleanor asked softly. Martha's face lit up. Of course, they're in Laramie. Perhaps you could visit next week. They made arrangements, and after the Simmons left, Eleanor and Caleb stood in the yard as the sun began to set. Are we crazy? Eleanor asked. We have 3 children already. The ranch is doing well, but we're not wealthy. 3 more mouths to feed. We'd manage, Caleb said. We always do. He turned to face her. But this is your decision as much as mine. If you don't want to do this, that's all right. We have enough. We don't need to take on more. Eleanor thought about it, really thought about it. Then she thought about stepping off that stagecoach, about Samuel collapsing in the heat, about Caleb's rough voice saying you can stay. I want to meet them, she said, at least that. And then we'll decide. The following week, they made the journey to Laramie, leaving their own children with Mrs. Jensen again. The orphanage was a simple building on the edge of town, clean but worn, filled with the sounds of children. Martha led them to a small room where 3 children sat waiting. The oldest, a boy with serious dark eyes, sat protectively between his 2 sisters. The middle child, a girl with wild curls, clutched a rag doll. The youngest, barely more than a baby, sucked her thumb and watched the strangers with wide eyes. This is James, Mary, and little Ruth, Martha said softly. Eleanor knelt down to their level. Hello, my name is Eleanor, and this is Caleb. We heard you need a home. James's jaw tightened. We stay together. If you can't take all of us, we're not going anywhere. The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded Eleanor so much of Thomas that her heart ached. We wouldn't dream of splitting you up. We know what it's like to need family. You have other kids? Mary asked, her voice small. 3, Caleb said. Thomas is 9, Lily's 12, and Samuel's 6. They'd be your brothers and sister, if you came to live with us. Ruth pulled her thumb out of her mouth long enough to ask, Would we have our own beds? You would, Eleanor promised, and food every day, and a place to run and play, and people who care about you. James studied them with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. Why do you want us? You already have kids. Caleb crouched down beside Eleanor. Because we have room in our home and in our hearts. Because we know what it's like to be alone and scared. And because family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to stand by each other no matter what. Something shifted in James's expression. You really mean that? Every word, Caleb said. They spent an hour with the children, talking, listening, watching them slowly begin to relax. By the time they left, Eleanor knew what her answer would be. In the wagon on the way home, Caleb voiced what she was thinking. We're going to do this, aren't we? Yes, Eleanor said. We are. It's going to be chaos. Probably. We'll need to add on to the house, build more beds. The children will have to share rooms. We'll figure it out, Eleanor said, echoing his words from months ago. We always do. Caleb reached for her hand. You're an amazing woman, Eleanor Granger. And you're a good man, Caleb Granger. Better than you give yourself credit for. When they told their own children that evening, the reactions were mixed. Thomas was immediately enthusiastic. More siblings meant more people to play with, more hands to help with chores. Lily was cautious but curious, asking practical questions about space and resources. Samuel wanted to know if he'd still be the baby. "You'll be a big brother now," Eleanor told him. "That's even more special." Samuel considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I can teach them things, like how to catch frogs." 2 weeks later, they brought James, Mary, and Ruth home to the ranch. The children were quiet at first, overwhelmed by the space and the animals and the sheer openness of the land. But slowly, carefully, they began to unfold. James attached himself to Thomas, following the older boy around and learning everything he could about ranch work. Mary discovered she loved the chickens and appointed herself their official caretaker. Ruth, after a tearful first few nights, began sleeping through in the room she shared with her sisters, her thumb in her mouth and a smile on her face. The house was chaos. 6 children ranging from 3 to 12 meant constant noise, endless laundry, meals that never seemed to fill everyone up, and disputes that needed mediating. Eleanor sometimes fell into bed so exhausted she could barely move, and Caleb worked from before dawn until after dark expanding the house, adding rooms, building more furniture. But it was good chaos, happy chaos. One evening in late November, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the main room and watched her family. All 6 children were sprawled on the floor, playing some complicated game that involved rocks and sticks and rules only they understood. Caleb sat in his chair, supposedly reading a newspaper, but Eleanor could see him watching the children with a soft expression she'd never seen in those early desperate days. He looked up and caught her watching. "What are you thinking?" "That we're insane," Eleanor said. "Absolutely, completely insane." "Probably," Caleb agreed. "But happy?" "Deliriously." That winter was hard, the hardest Wyoming had seen in years. Snow piled high, temperatures dropped dangerously low, and there were days when they couldn't venture beyond the barn. But the house was warm, the children were fed, and every night they gathered together around the fire, telling stories and singing songs and simply being together. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, the creek swelled with runoff, and the land turned green with new growth. Caleb expanded the herd, hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and began teaching Thomas and James the business of raising cattle. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant in April. She stood in the kitchen one morning, her hand on her still flat stomach, tears streaming down her face. After everything, after running, after fighting, after nearly losing everything, she was carrying Caleb's child. A child born not of desperation, but of love, of choice, of the life they'd built together from nothing. When she told Caleb that night, he stood frozen for a long moment. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "Eleanor, I love you. I love this life we've built. I love those 6 kids in there who are probably destroying something as we speak. And I already love this baby." The children were thrilled when they found out. Lily immediately began planning. James wanted to know if it would be a boy he could teach things to, and Samuel was convinced the baby would be his special responsibility. The months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Eleanor grew round and glowing, and Caleb hovered like a nervous hen, driving her half mad with his protectiveness. On a warm September evening, almost exactly a year after Eleanor had first stepped off that stagecoach, she went into labor. The midwife from town came, and Caleb paced the porch while the children clustered together in worry. When the baby's cry finally split the air, Caleb burst into the room to find Eleanor exhausted but beaming, holding a tiny red-faced infant. "A daughter," the midwife announced, "healthy and strong." Caleb approached slowly, reverently, and when Eleanor placed the baby in his arms, his hands shook. "She's perfect." "She is," Eleanor agreed. "What should we name her?" Caleb looked down at the baby, then at Eleanor. "Anna, if that's all right with you, I want to honor her, the woman who made me believe in love the first time. But I also want her to know she's here because of you, because you brought me back to life." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Anna Eleanor, then. For both of us." The baby, Anna Eleanor Granger, was welcomed into the family with joy and chaos, and so much love Eleanor thought she might burst from it. The older children took turns holding her, arguing over who got to help, and generally making enough noise to wake the entire territory. That evening, after the midwife had left and the children were finally asleep, Caleb and Eleanor sat together on the porch, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Eleanor asked softly. "When I showed up desperate and half dead?" "Every day," Caleb said. "I think about how close I came to sending you away, how my life would look now if I had." "What changed your mind?" "Samuel," Caleb said simply. "When he collapsed, I saw my own helplessness reflected in your face, and I couldn't walk away from that. Couldn't let a child suffer because I was too locked in my own grief to care." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other." "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "We did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over their land, their home, their family. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. From inside the house came the sounds of children sleeping. The baby stirred slightly, and Caleb reached down to gently rock the cradle he'd built. Eleanor thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The fear and desperation, the brutal heat and endless dust, the storms that had nearly destroyed them, and the legal battles that had threatened to tear them apart. She thought about Caleb's cold eyes softening, about learning to trust again, about building a family from scattered pieces. "What are you grateful for?" Caleb asked, as if reading her thoughts. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I'm grateful for that stagecoach driver who left us stranded. I'm grateful for the heat that nearly killed us, because it brought us here. I'm grateful for every closed door and turned back, because they led me to the one door that opened." She looked at Caleb, at his weathered face and gentle eyes, at the hands that had built this life for them. "I'm grateful for you," she said, "for your courage in saying yes when you wanted to say no, for fighting for us, for learning to love again when you thought that part of you was dead." Caleb kissed her forehead. "I'm grateful for you too, for your strength, for your stubbornness, for refusing to let the world break you, for showing me that it's possible to start over, even when you think it's too late." Baby Anna made a small sound, and they both looked down at her, this tiny person who represented everything they'd built, everything they'd become. "She's going to grow up knowing she's loved," Eleanor said. "They all are. That's what we're giving them, not wealth or status or any of the things the Thorntons thought mattered, just love and stability and a place to belong." "That's everything," Caleb said. And it was. As the years passed, the Granger Ranch became known throughout the territory, not for its size or wealth, but for being the place where lost children found home. Eleanor and Caleb took in more over time, never turning away siblings who needed to stay together, never hesitating when they saw need. The house grew to accommodate them all. The land prospered under Caleb's careful stewardship and the children's eager help. And every evening, no matter how many children sat around the dinner table, Eleanor and Caleb found time to sit together on the porch and watch the sun set over their land. They never forgot what it had cost to build this life, never forgot the heat and dust and desperation that had brought them together. But they also never took for granted the gift they'd been given, the chance to start over, to choose love, to build family from nothing but determination and hope. Thomas grew into a fine young man who eventually took over much of the ranch management. Lily became a teacher, educating not just her siblings, but children from neighboring ranches. Samuel discovered a gift for working with horses and trained them with patient skill. James, Mary, and Ruth thrived, their early wariness replaced by confidence and joy. And little Anna Eleanor, growing up surrounded by siblings and parents who adored her, became the heart of the family, fierce and loving in equal measure. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Eleanor and Caleb stood in the same spot where she'd first stepped off the stagecoach. Now a much larger, more prosperous ranch, but still recognizably home. "Any regrets?" Caleb asked, his arm around her waist. Eleanor looked at the house bursting with children and life and laughter, at the land they'd tended together, at the man beside her who'd started as a stranger and become her partner in every possible way. "Not a single one," she said. Caleb pulled her close and kissed her, deep and sure, the way he'd learned to kiss her over years of loving. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "You know what the best part is?" he asked. "What?" "We're still just beginning. Still have years ahead of us, still have more to build, more to give, more to become. Eleanor smiled. Then let's get to it. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and the door swung open to reveal their entire family waiting, children of all ages, some theirs by birth and some by choice, but all theirs by love. The evening meal was waiting, and chaos and joy in the beautiful mess of family life. Eleanor Granger, who had once stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but 3 children in desperation, had found everything she'd never known she was searching for. Not rescue, not salvation, but partnership, purpose, and a love that had grown from the hardest soil imaginable. And Caleb Granger, who had locked himself away in grief and solitude, had learned that the heart could break and mend and grow larger than before, that family could be chosen as well as born, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply saying yes when every instinct screamed no. They had been broken people who found each other under a burning sky. And together, they had built something that would outlast them both. A home where love mattered more than blood, where belonging was earned through loyalty and devotion, where every child knew they were chosen and cherished. The ranch would pass to their children and their children's children, but the legacy would be something deeper than land or cattle or buildings. It would be the knowledge that family is what you build, not what you're born into. That home is where you're seen and valued and loved exactly as you are. And that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when you have nothing left to lose and everything to gain, when you step off a stagecoach into hell and find someone willing to walk through it with you. Eleanor and Caleb had survived. They had fought. They had chosen each other again and again until choice became certainty, and they had built a home under that endless Wyoming sky, not because they were rescued or saved, but because they had saved each other. That was the story they would tell their grandchildren someday, sitting on that same porch where so many evenings had been spent in quiet communion. They would talk about the heat and the dust, about storms and legal battles, about saying yes when it would have been easier to say no. But mostly, they would talk about love, the kind that grows slowly, earned through shared hardship and mutual respect, the kind that doesn't rescue but stands beside, the kind that says, I see you, I choose you, I will fight for you, and together we will build something worth having. And their grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and wanted and home, would understand that the greatest stories aren't about princes saving princesses or magic solving problems. The greatest stories are about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, choosing courage over fear, choosing love over loneliness, choosing to build rather than break. Eleanor and Caleb Granger chose. Every single day, they chose. And that made all the difference.